Nat Turner was a born-in slave who felt that God gave him a message to show white plantation owners that all men are created equal. He eventually caused a statewide conflict by rebelling, slaughtering dozens of slave owners, including their families. However, when Nat was a slave, he didn't follow the law and did things behind his owner's back. Overall, Nat Turner refused to compromise with the laws, court, and even his owner, which later led to his hanging after the rebellion. Nat Turner had many problems in his lifetime. His dad is mostly unknown, but he did leave his family before he knew his wife was pregnant. Nat's mother was brought from Africa and sold when Nat was yet to be born. Nat was born to a white plantation owner, Benjamin Turner, in Southampton County, Virginia. He was raised by his grandmother and mother. They believed that Nat was intended for some great purpose. Thus, they raised him with a strong religious background and an urge to do great things. Even at an early age, Nat wanted to help other slaves. Although it was illegal to teach slaves how to write, it was legal to teach them how to read. Nat would spend most of his time outside the plantation teaching slaves to read the Bible and how to speak to God. Once he believed that he was able to talk to God, he began to receive messages from God to his belief. In February of 1831, Nat saw a solar eclipse, and being an uneducated slave, thought it was a message from God. He interpreted the moon falling into darkness as evil falling over the earth, as an end to slavery was no longer a priority for white men. As July 4th, 1831 came rolling around, Nat had already convinced several slaves into his plan. He had created a small army of slaves, all convinced that God wanted white slave owners dead for their sins. They were ready to fight, but Nat felt terribly ill and was unable to go, so his men postponed. They said that slaves had waited more than a century for this moment. Slaves can wait to do this right with the man who speaks to God. Once Nat became well, he was back to planning for the rebellion. This is when things were starting to come together. August 13, 1831, Mount St. Helens erupted, causing a green halo around the sun. He took this as the final sign and got his men together ready to fight. On the night of August 20th, 1831, Nat and his closest circle sat down for their last meal together. The uprising began the next day. He escaped from his plantation August 21st, 1831. When the white adults and children were all asleep, Nat and the others escaped, meeting at the first house to be killed, Nat's master and his family. Nat and his many accomplices broke into Joseph Travis's house. Quietly, they went into the house, first starting in the master bedroom. All the slaves armed with axes, knives, and swords entered on high alert. The first to be killed was Mr. Travis. He was killed with an axe to his head while trying to protect his wife, who was the next to go the same way. They killed his kids while they lay in their beds, but forgot about the baby, and they couldn't leave one person no matter what, so Nat sent two of his most trusted rebels to finish the job. They continued doing this to every house with white families inside until it became light out. The exact number of deaths caused by Nat Turner's rebellion is unknown, but historians believe that around 55 whites were killed that night. When word had gotten around to the whites, a militia had confronted Nat and the other slaves when they tried to attack another house. One slave was killed and a few of them were taken as prisoners awaiting their death, but many escaped, including Nat. He hid by a nearby slave cabin with the others that had escaped. The next night, Nat tried to attack again, but was stopped by a militia. Nat was forced to go into hiding after that night. He was a wanted slave, dead or alive. In the hunt for Nat Turner, over 120 slaves were killed, whether it was for revenge by whites upset about the rebellion or accused by the court. This is one of the ways Nat Turner didn't compromise. The longer he was in hiding, the numbers of dead slaves grew. Any slave accused by the court to have any part in the rebellion almost never had a chance to be innocent. The court always ruled guilty because the slave owner would get compensation for a new slave, so there were no objections, except one, an 11-year-old boy who was accused of knowing where Nat was. The slave owner's daughter had grown very fond of the boy, and so her father begged for his life, insisting he was innocent. However, the court still sentenced him to his death. After a long and bloody hunt on October 30th, Nat was found not far from his deceased master's plantation. Nat was brought in by Benjamin Phillips when he had stumbled upon Nat in the woods. In his confession, however, he claimed 2 slaves betrayed him by telling Phillips where he was hiding. When he was brought in, Thomas R. Gray, a lawyer on the case, wanted to get the facts right even though everyone knew he was guilty. He wanted to hear it from Nat's side of the story. He went to the Southampton County jail cell to get Nat Turner's confession. It was only Gray and Turner in that jail cell nights before he was killed. To this day, many people don't know if what Gray wrote in his Confessions of Nat Turner is true, but many historians believe it to be accurate as far as what Nat Turner believed happened that night. After Nat lost his trial by a landslide, everyone voting he was guilty, he once again didn't choose to compromise. He wouldn't give up the names of the other slaves that helped him, though he did plead guilty to the rebellion. On November 11th, Nat Turner was hung after being charged with conspiring to rebel and making insurrection. Even after Nat Turner's death, what he did was never forgotten. Many historians believe that Nat Turner had a lot of influence in the Civil War. Historian Martin Goldman also believes this and has said that Nat's rebellion was the rebellion that served to change the course of American history in the 3 decades before the Civil War. Goldman, page 10. Nat Turner's rebellion was a major part of the Civil War inspiration. The Confederacy took revenge against the slaves by killing several slaves. The Union finished what Nat Turner had already started by ending slavery. Overall, Nat Turner created a statewide conflict by rebelling and slaughtering more than 55 whites. This created several other conflicts of whites wanting revenge, blacks being treated in crueler ways, and things overall being very tense in the South, especially Virginia. However, Nat Turner refused to compromise to limit the deaths of his own people or other slaves. The longer he stayed in hiding, the more lives that were lost. He could have compromised with the law and came forward so innocent slaves wouldn't be killed for something that he did. But he chose not to come forward until he was found near a swamp in the middle of a forest. In conclusion, Nat Turner was a slave who rebelled because God told him to end slavery. The way he thought to end slavery was to kill dozens of white families. This was a huge conflict because slaves had almost no rights, which is why in the search for Turner, hundreds of slaves were killed in the process due to Nat refusing to compromise with the laws.